Renee Ellison read the same taped-up book to a sleeping 5-year-old every night at 8:15, in a house she did not own, for $14 an hour. The book had cost 40 cents at a church rummage sale 19 years ago, a folding table out behind a little AIM sanctuary off Beatty's Ford Road, run by women in church hats who knew her grandmother's name. Its spine was held together now with 3 strips of yellowed tape and 1 rubber band she replaced every few months when it dried out and snapped. But the boy she read it to lived in a 6,000-square-foot house on Trad Hollow Lane, in the part of Charlotte where the lawns were cut on Tuesdays by men nobody learned the names of, and his mother had once spent more on a single weekend in Charleston than Renee would earn between Easter and the 4th of July. In 14 months, that boy would stand up in front of 19 other children in a kindergarten classroom and repeat 11 words he had heard at his own kitchen table. The teacher would go very still. A phone call would be made, and a marriage that had looked, from the outside, like a brochure for a life would crack straight down the middle. What Renee did with that worn little book in the months before and after would unbury a grave that had stayed quiet for 19 years, break a silence a whole family had agreed to keep, and put one short name on a wall in a city that had never once said it out loud. But that is the end. We have to go back to the beginning, to a bus stop at 6:04 in the morning, where a woman with a 40-cent book in her bag waited in the cold for a route that came late on Mondays. She was up at 5:40 every morning, 6 days a week. She did not need an alarm anymore. Her body had learned the hour the way it had learned grief without being asked. She slept in a satin scarf to keep her locks neat, and she untied it in the dark and tucked it into the drawer before her feet ever touched the floor. The radiator in her 1-bedroom on Pemberton Street knocked twice and went quiet. The rent was $740 a month, due on the 3rd, and she paid it in 2 envelopes because she got paid every 2 weeks, and the math only worked if she split it. She made her coffee in a dented percolator that had belonged to her grandmother, Mama Pearl, who had come up from Sumter as a girl with a cardboard suitcase and a Bible, and had raised Renee on a street 4 blocks from where Renee lived now, and who had died at 81 with $211 to her name, and a funeral that 46 people came to anyway. They had laid out the repast in the basement of the church afterward, long folding tables of cornbread and collard greens and 3 sweet potato pies, and the room had been louder with Thanksgiving than with grief, because that was the kind of life Mama Pearl had built. Renee drank the coffee black. She packed a lunch into the same soft-sided cooler she had carried for 11 years, 2 slices of bread, a boiled egg, an apple if there was one. On the good weeks there was a thermos of soup. She put the book in the outside pocket where it always went, the way some women carry a photograph. The 6:12 came at 6:19 on a good day. The ride was 41 minutes with 1 transfer at the Tryon Street station, where she stood under the same flickering panel of light, number 9 of 14, and waited for the second bus that took her out toward the lake and the long driveways. She had ridden some version of this route for 9 years. She had watched 3 drivers come and go. She knew the woman who sold loose cigarettes and gum outside the station by the name Miss Connie, the same way she knew the man who opened the barber shop on her own block at 7, and the family that ran the corner store where she bought her envelopes. And every Friday Renee bought a pack of grape gum she did not chew and left it on the bench for whatever child came through. Because Mama Pearl used to say a thing Renee had never stopped hearing. "You don't have to be somebody to somebody," Mama Pearl would say, wringing out a rag over a sink that was never her own sink, humming a hymn under her breath the whole time without ever noticing she did it. "You just have to show up. Showing up is the only thing in this world you can't fake and can't buy." Mama Pearl had cleaned houses for 51 years. She cleaned the kind of houses that had a back door for people like her and a front door for the people who lived there, and she never once let Renee believe that the door she came through said anything true about her worth. She kept a scripture card folded in her apron pocket, so worn the ink had gone the color of weak tea. She said grace over saltines. She showed up. When she was dying in a county bed in the fall, 4 of the women whose floors she had mopped for 30 years drove out to sit with her, and one of them held her hand for 2 hours and called her Miss Pearl, and that was the only time in her life anyone had ever put a miss in front of her name. Renee had learned the lesson early and the hard way, and then she had learned it again harder. She had been married once to a good-enough man named Curtis who drove a delivery truck and laughed easily and could not, in the end, stay in a house with that much quiet. They had a son. His name was Isaiah. He had a gap in his front teeth and a way of counting everything. Stairs, birds, the seconds between lightning and thunder, and he was afraid of the dark in a specific way. Not of monsters, but of being the only one awake. So every night Renee read to him until his breathing went long and even. And the book he wanted, every single night, for almost 2 years, was a 40-cent picture book about a small harbor tugboat named Tully, who was too little to pull the big ships and spent the whole story certain he didn't matter, until the night a fog came in so thick the big boats couldn't see, and the only light low enough and slow enough to lead them home was Tully's. Small boats matter too, the last page said, especially in the fog. Isaiah died 3 weeks after his 5th birthday. There is a way to say what took him that makes it sound like a story, and a way to say it that is just true, and Renee had stopped years ago telling it either way. It was fast, and it was not anyone's fault, and it left a 5-year-old's shoes by a door that did not need them anymore. Curtis left 11 months later. He sent a card the first 2 Christmases and then he didn't, and Renee did not blame him, because there are 2 ways to survive a thing like that, and his was distance and hers was the opposite, and you cannot ask 2 drowning people to hold each other up. Hers was the opposite. Hers was to be near children, other people's children, since she would never have her own again. She got her childcare certification at 41, sitting in a community college classroom with women half her age, and she had been minding other families' babies ever since. $14 an hour, no benefits, no sick days that paid. Walking through their front doors at 7:30 and out of them at 6, and carrying, the whole time, in the outside pocket of a soft-sided cooler, a book she had not been able to give away and could not bear to read alone. On the first Saturday of every month, on her one true day off, Renee took the 9:05 bus the other direction, toward the river, to the pediatric floor of Hawthorne Rehabilitation, where a charge nurse named Doreen had known her since the bad year and let her in without a badge. Renee sat in a yellow plastic chair beside whatever bed had a child in it who was scared of being the only one awake, and she read about a small tugboat in the fog, and she did this for free, and she told no one. Not the families she worked for, not the women at her church, the ones she stood beside in the choir loft on Sunday mornings singing the old songs Mama Pearl had hummed over the sink. Not Curtis, the 2 years he still called. The book went soft at the corners from the children's hands. She taped it, she replaced the rubber band, she showed up. The Whitmores hired her in the spring of the year Kamari turned 3, after the agency sent over 4 candidates, and Bryant Whitmore, who interviewed exactly one of them because he had a 4:30, he could not move, asked Renee precisely 2 questions and then asked her to start Monday. He was a developer. He had taken his father's small commercial real estate office on Beatty's Ford Road, in the heart of what had once been the city's black business district, where his father had hung a shingle when no bank uptown would lend a black man a dime, and he had turned it, over 19 years, into a firm that had its name on the side of 3 towers uptown in a logo. Renee did not understand carved into glass in the lobby of the building where he kept the 14th floor. He was 44. He was kind in the careless way of a man who has never been told no by the world and so has never had to develop the muscle of paying attention. He shook Renee's hand and said, "Kamari's the only thing in that house that matters, so you know," and then his phone rang and he answered it, and that was the interview. Kamari had been 3 years old, with a vocabulary of maybe 200 words and a fierce private system of rules about which spoon was the morning spoon, when Renee Ellison walked into his life carrying a 40-cent book. He was 5 now. He could count to 100 if you let him slow down at the 60s, where the words got long and treacherous. He counted everything: the stairs in the front hall, which were 14, the panes in the kitchen window, which were 12, the seconds between the flash of the espresso machine's blue light and the sound it made, which were always 2. He had a gap coming in where a front tooth had loosened the week before, and a way of going completely silent and watchful when adults spoke fast, and at 8:15 every night in a 6,000-square-foot house. He was afraid of the dark in a specific way that Renee had recognized the first week and had never once mentioned to his parents, because it was not hers to give away. He was not afraid of monsters. He was afraid of being the only one awake. So she read to him. Not the bright cardboard books his mother bought in stacks of 6 from the store with the wooden toys, the ones that stayed flat-spined and perfect on the shelf. He wanted the one with the tape and the rubber band. The first night she pulled it out, he had reached up and touched the tape with one finger, the way you touch something that has been hurt, and he had said, "Why is it broken?" And Renee had said, "It's not broken, it's been loved a lot. That's different." And Kamari had thought about that with the whole of his small, serious face and then had leaned his head against her arm and said, "Read the boat one," though she had not yet told him there was a boat one, and she never figured out how he knew, and some nights she let herself believe a thing she would never have said out loud. She read him Tully the Tugboat, 300 and some nights of it. Small boats matter too, especially in the fog. Kamari said the last line with her the way Isaiah used to, his voice going soft and certain at the same time, and Renee held the book the way you hold the one thing you have left, and she did not tell anyone what it cost her and what it gave her, because some accounts you keep only with yourself. What she did not know, what she could not have known, riding the 619 in the dark, with her grandmother's lesson folded in her chest, was that the woman who paid her $14 an hour, the woman who walked past her in the front hall most mornings without seeing her, the woman who would one day stand up and call her the help in front of her own child, had ridden a bus exactly like this one, in the dark more than 30 years ago, beside a mother who cleaned houses. Sabrina Whitmore had been born Sabrina Doss, in a two-room rented half of a house off Statesville Avenue. In a year she had spent a great deal of money and effort in the years since making other people forget. Her mother's name was Della. Della Doss had come up from Orangeburg as a young woman and had cleaned houses for 26 years, big ones, out toward the lake, the kind with a back door. And she had ridden the bus to them every morning with her daughter beside her in the years before there was anyone to leave the girl with. Sabrina had done her homework on those buses. She had learned the smell of other people's cleaning supplies before she learned cursive. She had waited, 8 years old, 9, 10, on a folding stool in the corner of a laundry room while her mother worked, and she had watched the children of those houses come home from schools with their own buses and crested blazers, and she had learned a thing about the world so early and so completely that she had spent her whole adult life building walls high enough to keep from ever feeling it again. She had learned that there were two kinds of people, the ones who got seen and the ones who got walked past, and she had decided, somewhere around the age of 10, on a stool in a stranger's laundry room, that she would die before she stayed the second kind. It was not a cruel decision. It was the decision of a frightened, clever child, and the cruelty came later, the way it almost always does, dressed up as good sense. Della had a saying too. Mothers in that part of town all had a saying. It was the only inheritance they could be sure of passing down. But where Mama Pearl had told Renee that showing up was the thing you couldn't buy, Della Doss, exhausted and proud and bent from 26 years of other people's floors, had told her bright, ashamed daughter something different. She told it to her on the bus, and in the laundry rooms, and the night Sabrina cried because a girl named Whitney had asked, in front of everyone, whose maid that lady was, meaning Della, meaning her own mother. "Don't you ever let them see where you come from?" Della said, holding her daughter's chin in a hand that smelled of lemon and bleach. "You hear me? They'll hold it against you your whole life. Get yourself somewhere they can't smell it on you, and then don't you look back." She meant it as armor. She meant, be more than I was allowed to be. But a child takes the shape of the words, not the love inside them, and the shape of those words was a door slammed on a whole part of yourself. Don't let them see where you come from. Get somewhere they can't smell it. Don't look back. Sabrina did not look back. She was good at school in the ferocious way of someone for whom it is the only exit. She got the scholarship. She got the degree. She got the job in commercial leasing where, at 29, she met a developer named Bryant Whitmore across a closing table and understood, with the same clear, cold instinct that had served her on the stool, that this was the far side of the door. She did not lie to him exactly. She just let the laundry rooms fall away. By the time they married, she had a story about her upbringing that was true in every individual fact and false in its whole, the way a house can be built entirely of real bricks and still be a facade. Her mother was no longer with us, which was true. Della had died at 58 of a heart that had been asked to do too much for too little. In the same year Sabrina got engaged, and Sabrina had paid for a funeral so quiet and so far from the old neighborhood that almost none of the women Della had worked beside even heard about it. There was no repast in any church basement, no long tables, no hymns. She had buried her mother the way you bury a thing you are ashamed of. She had told herself it was dignity. She had told herself a great many things. And now she was 38, and she lived in a 6,000-square-foot house on Trad Hollow Lane, with a husband worth more money than she could feel, and a son she loved with a fierceness that frightened her. And the only thing in the world that could still get past all the walls she had built was the sight of a tired black woman in soft-soled shoes coming through a back hallway with a cleaning rag or a lunch cooler. The smell of lemon and bleach, the satin scarf, the sauceled shoes, the look of a woman who showed up for other people's children and went home at 6. She could not have told you why those women made her chest go tight and her voice go sharp. She had built the walls so high and so long ago that she no longer knew what was on the other side of them. She only knew that when she looked at Renee Ellison, something in her wanted to push the woman as far away as the laundry rooms, and she mistook that pushing for taste, and she said cruel small things in a light voice, and she repeated her mother's lesson to her own son without ever once recognizing it coming out of her mouth. "We don't get attached to the help baby," she would say to Camry, smoothing his collar, smiling. "She's not family. She leaves at 5. She did not see the boy's face when she said it. She did not see Renee 3 feet away folding a small sweater, going still. There were 3 floors and a marble stair between the room where Sabrina got dressed each morning and the kitchen where Renee gave Kamari his breakfast, and most mornings Sabrina came down all the way and walked the length of that kitchen and out to the garage without her eyes once landing on the woman feeding her child. Renee was a fact of the house, like the espresso machine, like the woman who came Tuesdays for the lawn. Sabrina would call out a list. Kamari has the dentist at 2:40. Don't let him near the pool. The Hendersons are coming Friday, so I need him bathed by 6. And she would deliver this list to the air of the room, to the cabinets, to her own phone, never to Renee's eyes, and Renee would say, "Yes, ma'am," to a back that was already moving toward the door. 3 feet apart, every single morning. One of them carrying a dead child she had buried in private, the other carrying a dead mother she had buried in shame. One reading a 40-cent book to a frightened boy at 8:15. The other choosing from a closet bigger than the room Sabrina had grown up in, the armor for another day of being seen. Neither one knowing the first thing about the other. The same fog, exactly, and neither of them able to see the small light that was right there in the house with them, low enough and slow enough to lead them home. Kamari saw it. Kamari, who counted everything, who went silent and watchful when the adults talked fast, had been quietly keeping an account of his own for 2 years, in the way of small children, who are the only honest auditors any house has. He knew that his mother smelled like the bottle on her dresser and that Renee smelled like coffee in the bus. He knew that his father's hand on his head meant goodbye, and Renee's hand on his head meant I'm here. He knew that the bright new books stayed flat and the broken one got red. He knew, the way he knew the stairs were 14 and the window had 12 panes, that one of the women in his house left at 5, and one of them stayed in the soft dark with him until he wasn't the only one awake, and he had not yet been told by anyone that he was supposed to keep these 2 facts apart. He had not yet learned the shape of his mother's lesson. He was 5. He still thought love was something you were allowed to put wherever you found it. The morning it started to come apart was a Thursday in late October, cold for Charlotte, 39 degrees at the bus stop where Renee waited at 6:04 for a route that was running 8 minutes late. She had the book in the outside pocket. She had $31 in her account until Friday. She did not know that in the kitchen of the house on Trad Hollow Lane, the rubber band around the book's spine would snap that afternoon, and that what happened next would happen fast. The way the important things always do, the way the fog comes in. It happened a little after 4:30, while the light was going golden low, through the 12 panes of the kitchen window, and Kamari sat at the island with the book open in front of him, sounding out the word harbor with the tip of one finger under each letter. Renee was at the counter cutting an apple into the 8 slices he liked, no more, no fewer, when the front door went and Sabrina came in early, 2 hours early, in a state Renee had learned to read from the sound of the heels alone. There had been a lunch that day, out at the club by the lake, 11 women at a long table, and a woman named Whitney Pruitt. There is always a Whitney, had said, light over the salads, that she could have sworn she remembered a Doss family from the old days off Statesville, cleaned for the Aldridges, wasn't that funny, before catching herself and saying surely not, surely a different Doss. And Sabrina had laughed and agreed it was a common enough name and changed the subject and driven home with both hands tight on the wheel and the laundry rooms rising up at the back of her throat like bile she had swallowed 30 years ago and never fully gotten down. So she was not, when she came into her own kitchen, looking at a 5-year-old and a tired woman and a 40-cent book. She was looking at the back door of a stranger's house. She was 10 years old on a folding stool, and the first thing her eyes landed on was the book. What is that? It was not a question. She crossed the kitchen and lifted it out from under Kamara's finger, and the dried-out rubber band which had been waiting all day chose that moment to snap. It flew off and skittered under the refrigerator, and the loose back cover swung open, and a 40-cent picture book about a tugboat sat exposed in Sabrina Whitmore's manicured hand like something pulled out of the trash. It's a story he likes, Renee said, even. I read it to him at night. It's filthy. Sabrina held it by one corner. The tape, the soft brown corners, the rubber band gone. Where did this come from? Did you bring this into my house? I've had it a long time, Renee said. It's somebody's garbage. Sabrina set it down on the island the way you set down something you don't want to keep touching, 2 slices away from the apple. And then she turned to her son, and she crouched, and she smoothed his collar with both hands and gave him the smile she gave him. The one that was real, the one she meant. And that was the worst of it, that she meant it. Baby, listen to mommy. We don't keep things other people threw away. We have nice things. We can buy you any book in the world, the brand new ones, with the hard covers. You don't need this. Kamari looked at the book. He looked at Renee. He did not say anything. He had gone silent and watchful the way he did. And listen. Sabrina's voice dropped into something gentle and certain, a mother passing down the only thing she was sure of. I see you hugging on Miss Renee. I know you love her. But here's something you're old enough to understand now. She held his small face in a hand that smelled of the bottle on her dresser. She's not family, she's the help. You don't hug the help, okay? You be polite. But you keep that here. She touched his chest. Family's here, the help leaves at 5. She said it the way Della had said the other thing to her, with her whole heart believing it was armor. She did not hear her own mother in it. She never once heard her own mother in it. Renee stood at the counter with the paring knife in her hand and the 8th slice of apple half-cut, and she did not move and she did not speak. She counted 11 seconds, the way she had taught herself to count in the bad year, when the only way through a thing was to give your mind a number and follow it to the other side. 11 seconds. Her back was straight, her eyes were dry. She had buried a 5-year-old, and she had buried her marriage, and she had buried Mama Pearl, and she had learned, at a cost no one in this kitchen could begin to read, that there is a kind of standing still that is the loudest thing a person can do. She did not defend the book. She did not defend herself. The woman who had never asked the world for anything, and had never once tried to take back what was taken, did not start now. At the end of the 11 seconds she finished cutting the apple. 8 slices. She slid the plate in front of Kamari. She crossed the kitchen, got down on her knees in her soft-soled shoes, and reached under the refrigerator until her fingers found the snapped rubber band, and she put it in her pocket. Then she picked the book up off the island, 2 slices from the apple, and she held it the way you hold something fragile that has already been broken once and lived, and she said to Sabrina, in a voice with nothing in it but quiet, "Yes, ma'am, I'll keep it in my bag." "Thank you," Sabrina said, already turning, already gone, her heels going back across the marble and up the stairs, the day's armor needing to come off and the Hendersons coming at 6. That night, at 8:15, in the soft dark of a boy's room in a house worth more than the street Renee was born on, she taped the back cover and threaded a new rubber band around the spine, and read about a tugboat too little to matter, and Kamari said the last line with her, soft and certain. Small boats haunts matter too, especially in the fog. And then he was quiet for a while, counting something behind his eyes, and just before sleep took him he said, not to her exactly, more to the dark, "You're not the help." Renee held very still. "You can stay past 5, Kamari said. "I'll tell them." She did not tell him no, and she did not tell him yes, and she did not tell him the thing she knew, which was that the world he was about to walk into did not work the way his heart still did. She turned off the lamp. She sat with him until his breathing went long and even, and he was not the only one awake. Then she rode the 9:14 home in the dark with a retaped book in her bag, and she did not know, and Sabrina did not know, and Bryant in his car on the 14th floor of his own life did not know, that the boy lay in the dark holding 11 words his mother had given him with her whole heart, turning them over and over the way he turned over everything, and that in the morning he would carry them out the 14 stairs and into the world, where children, the only honest auditors a house has ever had, say out loud the things the grown-ups have agreed to keep. He was 5. He still thought he could fix it by telling the truth. Bryant Whitmore came home at 7:50 on a Tuesday in November, which was so far outside the pattern of his life that Renee, reading on the edge of Kamari's bed, heard the garage door and thought for a moment it was a stranger. A deal had gone sideways that afternoon, 11 months of work on a 4-acre parcel off South Boulevard, gone in a single 40-minute phone call from a man in Atlanta who did not bother to sound sorry. Bryant had sat in his car in the deck on the 14th floor for 19 minutes afterward without turning the key. He was 44 years old, and he had built a wall of busyness 19 years high, brick by brick, the way some men build, so that there would never be a quiet hour in which the things he did not look at could catch up to him. And the failed deal had taken the bricks away for one evening and left him with nowhere to be at 8:15, which was a time of day he had not in 2 years known anything about. He came up the stairs in his socks. He stopped in the doorway of his son's room because the lamp was low and the boy was nearly under, and he heard the woman he paid $14 an hour say, in a voice he had never once actually listened to, "Small boats matter too, especially in the fog." And he heard his son say it back, soft and certain, the two of them folding the words between them, like a thing that belonged to them and to no one else in the house. He waited in the hall until Kamari's breathing went long. When Renee came out with her bag and the taped rubber-banded book inside it, he was still standing there, and he startled her, and he said, "Sorry, I didn't mean to." And then, because the day had pried all his usual exits away from him, he asked her a real question, possibly the first one he had asked her in the 2 years she had raised his son. "That book, he won't let anyone touch it but you. Where'd it come from?" Renee could have said a church sale. She had said a church sale 100 times. It was true, and it was a wall, and it had served. But it was 8:20 on the worst night of Bryant Whitmore's professional life, and he had asked it the way you ask a thing you actually want the answer to, and she was tired and she was 51, and there are some doors a person can only open when they are too tired to keep holding them shut. "It was my son's," she said. Bryant did not say he hadn't known she had a son. He did not say anything at all. He had spent 19 years filling silences before they could fill him, and for once in his own hallway he let one stand. "His name was Isaiah," Renee said. "He counted everything. Stairs, birds, the seconds between the lightning and the thunder. He had a gap right here." She touched her own front tooth. "He was scared of the dark, but not the regular way. He wasn't scared of anything in the dark. He was scared of being the only one awake in it. So every night I read him that book until his breathing went long and he knew he wasn't alone. Almost 2 years, the same book." She looked at the bag in her hand. "He was 5, he'd be 24 this spring. I read it to him 3 weeks after his 5th birthday, and then there wasn't any more reading to do." She did not tell him how. She never told anyone how. It was fast, and it was no one's fault, and it left a pair of small shoes by a door that did not need them. She told him only the rest of it, the plain shape of a life, that the boy's father, Curtis, a good enough man, had lasted 11 more months in a house with that much quiet and then had not been able to, and had sent a card the first 2 Christmases and then nothing, and that she did not blame him, because there are 2 ways to survive a thing like that, and his was distance and hers was the opposite. Hers was to be near children. Other people's, since there would be no more of her own. Bryant Whitmore, who owned 3 towers and a logo cut into glass in a lobby downtown, stood in his own hallway in his socks and did not offer her one single thing. Not advice, not money, not the terrible smoothing sentences that frightened people say to make the silence stop. He just listened, the way Renee had spent her life teaching frightened boys that listening was the whole of love. After a long while he said, "He has a gap coming in, Kamari does, right there." He touched his own tooth, the same place she had touched hers. "I'm gone a lot," he said, and stopped, because that was as near as a man like that could come on that night to saying the truest thing about himself. "Thank you for reading to him." It was the first time anyone in that house had ever thanked Renee for anything. She rode the 914 home in the dark, and she did not cry, because she had taught herself a long time ago to count instead of cry, and she counted the stops between his life and hers, which were 9, and she got off at the 9th. The phone call came 13 days later, on a Thursday, from the Marlowe School, where Kamari was one of 19 children in the kindergarten of a teacher named Ms. Okafor. It had been an ordinary morning. Ms. Okafor ran a morning circle on Thursdays, where the children took turns with a thing they loved, and that day a boy had brought a plastic dinosaur, and a girl had brought a photograph of a dog that had died, and Cambery, who had brought nothing from home because the thing he loved most was not his to bring, had told the circle about the boat one instead. He told them about Tully the tugboat, who was too little to pull the big ships, and spent the whole story certain he didn't matter, until the night the fog came in so thick the big boats couldn't see, and the only light low enough and slow enough to lead them home was Tully's. He recited the last line in his soft certain voice, with his eyes half closed the way he said it in the dark. Small boats matter too, especially in the fog. And a girl named Priya, who was 6 and missing both front teeth, asked who read it to him. "Miss Renee," Kamari said. "Is she your mom?" Priya asked, the way 5- and 6-year-olds ask, with no floor beneath the question. And Kamari, who counted everything, who had been holding 11 words for 13 days the way he held every hard thing, turning it over and over behind his eyes trying to make it come out in a shape that fit, said them, flat, in the exact voice they had been given to him. "She's not family, she's the help. You don't hug the help." The other children did not understand it. It slid past them, and the circle moved on toward snack. But Miss Okafor at the front of the room went very still. She went still for the length of a held breath, and then another, because she had just heard a 5-year-old say a grown person's whole sentence in a grown person's whole voice, and she had been a teacher long enough to know exactly what that was, and exactly what it cost a small boy to carry a thing like that around inside a body that did not have anywhere to put it. And then a small thing happened that she would tell people about for years. Priya frowned at Kamari with the flat, merciless logic of a child naming a truth that all the adults had managed to lose, and she said, "But she reads you the boat one, so she is your family." Kamari looked at Priya. He looked down at the place on his own chest where his mother's hand had pressed when she told him family went here. He had 2 true things now, and the world had told him they could not both be true. And there is nothing a 5-year-old can do with 2 true things that will not fit except the one thing he did, which was to begin very quietly, to cry. Miss Okafor crossed the room and knelt and gathered him in, and over his shoulder her eye fell on the taped, rubber-banded book that had slid out of his cubby onto the carpet, and her own breath stopped in her chest. Because she knew that book. 6 years ago, her sister's boy Daniel had spent 4 months on the pediatric floor of Hawthorne Rehabilitation, and on the first Saturday of every one of those 4 months a tired woman in soft-soled shoes had come up to the second floor and sat in the yellow plastic chair beside the bed of whatever child on the ward was the most afraid, and had read aloud in a low voice a 40-cent picture book about a tugboat, and had never once told a soul her name. Miss Okafor had asked the charge nurse about her, a woman named Doreen, and Doreen had said only, "She doesn't want a name, she just comes." Miss Okafor had carried the memory of that nameless woman for 6 years, the way you carry the unrepaid debts of the worst season of your life. And now the woman's book was lying on the floor of her own classroom, and a 5-year-old was crying into her shoulder because someone had taught him to call that woman the help. She called both parents in the next afternoon. They came together, which surprised even them. The conference room had small chairs built for the parents of small children, and Bryant folded himself into one and Sabrina sat very straight in another in a cook that cost more than the teacher made in a month. Miss Okafor did not lecture them. She had learned that lecturing closes the only doors worth opening. She simply told them plainly and in order what Comrie had said in the circle. Both halves of it. The boat first, then the 11 words exactly as he had said them, so that they would have to hear the way she had heard the 2 things their son had been made to hold at the same time. She told them what Priya had said. She watched Bryant's face do something old and complicated, and saw him touch, without knowing he did it, the gap in his own front tooth. And then she told them the last part, the part she had only understood the day before with the book on the floor, that the woman they called the help had spent the first Saturday of every month for years sitting with dying children for free and reading them the very book she read their son to sleep with, and that she, Miss Okafor, had been trying for 6 years to thank that woman and had never once learned her name. Sabrina Whitmore sat in a chair built for somebody's mother and heard her own son's voice saying her own sentence, and underneath it, rising up the back of her throat the way it had been rising for 30 years, she heard a second voice. A bus in the dark off Statesville Avenue, a folding stool in the corner of a stranger's laundry room, a hand that smelled of lemon and bleach holding her chin the night a girl named Whitney had asked, in front of everyone, whose maid that lady was, meaning Della, meaning her own mother. "Don't you ever let them see where you come from. They'll hold it against you your whole life. Get yourself somewhere they can't smell it on you, and then don't you look back." She heard her mother teaching her to be ashamed in order to save her, and she heard herself teaching her own son to be ashamed of the one woman in his life who had stayed in the dark with him until he was not the only one awake. And she understood, all at once and far too late, that she had never escaped the laundry rooms at all. She had only crossed to the front of the house. She had become the very women she had hated from her stool, and she had raised her boy to do to Renee exactly what Whitney Pruitt had once done Della, to look at a woman who cleaned and cared and showed up and stayed and call her nothing at all. For the first time in 19 years, since a funeral she had paid to make so small and so far from the old neighborhood that almost none of the women Della had worked beside ever heard it had happened, Sabrina cried. Not the way grief sounds in movies, the way it sounds in school parking lots and in cold gold cars, low and broken and with no audience left to perform any kind of dignity for. She put her face in her hands in a chair built for a child's parent, and she said her mother's name out loud for the first time in a decade. Her name was Della, she said to Bryant, to the small empty desks, to no one. Della Doss. She came up from Orangeburg and she cleaned houses for 26 years and she was somebody, and I let them put her in the ground like she was something to be embarrassed about. Bryant reached over and put his hand on her back, which was a thing he had not done in longer than he could say, and he did not tell her it was all right because it was not. And they both, for once, let that be true. They did not throw money at it, which Renee would never have permitted in any case. Bryant came down to the kitchen on a Saturday morning, a day he was never ever home, and sat across the island from her while Sabrina stood in the doorway with her hands not knowing what to do with themselves. "I'd like to do something," Bryant said, "and I think if I get the shape of it wrong you'll turn it down flat and you'd be right to, so I'm going to try to say the right shape." Renee waited. She was good at waiting. "I don't want to give you money," I called Hawthorne. "I talked to your nurse, Doreen. I want to put a fund on the second floor, a room, books and people paid to do every single day, on every floor, what you have been doing one Saturday a month, for free for years. And I want my son's reading room to have a name on the wall by the door. I want it to be Isaiah's name, where every family that comes through that floor scared out of their minds can read it." Renee held very still, and this time she did not count. "And I want you to run it," he said, "not as charity. As a job, with the things a real job has, the things you've gone without your whole working life. You'd still be with Comrie if you'll have us, which God knows you've got no reason to. But I am not offering you a handout. I'm offering you the work, and you would earn every dollar of it, the same way you have earned everything you have ever had, which is more than I can honestly say for half of what I've got." It was Sabrina who could not stay in the doorway. She came to the island, and she did the single hardest thing she had done since she was 10 years old on a folding stool. She let another human being see exactly where she came from. "My mother cleaned houses," she said, looking Renee full in the eyes for the first time in 2 years, 26 years. "She came up from Orangeburg and rode the bus with me in the dark before there was anybody to leave me with. She wore a satin scarf to bed, and she had soft shoes like yours, and her hands smelled like lemon, and I was so ashamed of her that I let her be buried with nobody there. I've spent 30 years building a life where nobody would ever look at me the way they looked at her." Her voice came apart in her hands. "And then I taught my baby to look at you that way. I'm not going to ask you to forgive that, because I don't think I've earned the right to even ask. I'm asking you to let us put one good thing into the world with your boy's name on it. Because I owe a debt to a woman who's been dead 12 years, and putting Isaiah's name on that wall is the only way I can think of left to start paying it." Renee Ellison looked at the two of them for a long time. She thought about Mama Pearl, 51 years of wringing out a rag over a sink that was never her own, humming the old hymns, dead at 81 with $211 to her name, and 46 people at her funeral anyway. She thought about a yellow plastic chair. She thought about a boy with a gap in his teeth who had been afraid of being the only one awake, and a boy asleep upstairs with the same gap coming in and the same exact fear, and she understood that she had somehow been set down in the narrow space between two frightened children 19 years apart, and that maybe all the showing up, all those years of it, had been leading somewhere the whole time, and she just had not been able to make it out through the fog. "I don't take what I haven't earned," she said, "but I will work for that. I will work for that gladly every day they'll have me." And then, because she was who she was and had always been, she set down one condition. "Isaiah's name goes on the wall, but you put hers under it, Della's, Della Das. So the children's mothers, the ones who mop the floors of the rooms their babies are lying in, the ones everybody assumes leave at 5, can walk in and see a name just like their own up there in brass, where every single person who comes through that door has to read it." Sabrina put her hand over her mouth and could only nod, because there were no words left in her that would hold their shape. By the following autumn, there was a room on the second floor of Hawthorne with 211 books shelved in it. Renee had counted them the day they finished stocking it, and the number had made her laugh out loud, alone in the empty room, because it was the exact number of dollars her grandmother had died with, and it turned out the world did keep some accounts after all, just not on any schedule a person could plan around. By the door there was a small brass plate, and it said nothing fancy. It said a Sakas corner, and beneath that in the same plain letters, for Della Das who showed up. There were 4 people paid to read on the floors now every day of the week, instead of one tired woman one Saturday a month. In its first year the room logged a little over 3,000 bedside readings, and Renee kept the count herself by hand in a ledger, because numbers had always been the rope she used to pull herself to the far side of a hard thing. Kamari was 6. The front tooth had come out and the new one had grown in, the gap already closing the way childhood closes things. On the first Saturday of every month his father, who was home now in a way he had not been in 19 years, drove him out to Hawthorne, and the boy climbed up into the yellow plastic chair beside whatever child on the ward was the most afraid that day, and he read about a small tugboat in the fog, and when he reached the last line he stopped and let the other child say it with him, soft and certain, exactly the way it had been handed to him, exactly the way it had been handed to a boy named Isaiah before either of them was born. He had been taught 2 sentences in his short life, 2 whole sentences about who counts and who doesn't, and somewhere along the way, in the quiet where children do their real deciding, he had chosen which one of them was true. Sabrina drove out to the old neighborhood off Statesville Avenue that spring. It took her 4 separate tries before she could make herself turn down the street. She found 2 of the women who had cleaned houses beside her mother for all those years, both of them old now and slow, and she sat in a small warm kitchen that smelled like the very thing she had spent her whole life running from. Collard greens on the stove, cornbread cooling on the counter, a sweet potato pie under a dish towel, and she said her mother's name, and then she did the thing she had never once done. She listened. She let them tell her about Della Das. "Della, Lord child," one of them said, shaking her head and laughing low. That woman could make a way out of no way. That her mother had kept a scripture card folded in her apron pocket until the ink went the color of weak tea. That she had quietly paid another woman's bus pass out of nothing for a whole year so the woman wouldn't lose a job. That she had sung second soprano in the choir and never missed a Sunday. That she had been, in every way the front of the house had never bothered to learn somebody. Sabrina drove home that night in the dark, and for the first time in 30 years, the dark did not smell like shame to her. It just smelled, finally, like home. If this story made you think of someone the world keeps walking straight past, the woman who cleans the room, the one who shows up at the bedside, the one you assume goes home at 5, send it to them. And tell them that you saw them. And then sit a minute with the question that splits this room right down the middle. Sabrina was cruel because she had been taught to be ashamed, and she was taught it by a mother who loved her and was only trying to build her some armor against a world that had already cut them both. When you finally understand where a person's cruelty came from, when you can follow the thread all the way back to the wound it grew out of, does the understanding make the cruelty forgivable? Or does knowing the reason only explain the damage, while the child goes on carrying the scar just the same? There is no clean answer. There is only a woman in a yellow plastic chair, and a boy who got to choose which of 2 sentences to believe, and a small light that turned out in the end to be low enough and slow enough to lead a whole family home through the fog. Small boats matter too, especially in the fog. This is a work of fiction. The characters, names, and events are imagined, and any resemblance to real people is coincidental. If this story made you think of someone the world keeps walking straight past, the woman who cleans the room, the one who shows up at the bedside, the one you assume goes home at 5, send it to them. And tell them that you saw them. And then sit a minute with the question that splits this room right down the middle. Sabrina was cruel because she had been taught to be ashamed, and she was taught it by a mother who loved her and was only trying to build her some armor against a world that had already cut them both. When you finally understand where a person's cruelty came from, when you can follow the thread all the way back to the wound it grew out of, does the understanding make the cruelty forgivable? Or does knowing the reason only explain the damage, while the child goes on carrying the scar just the same? There is no clean answer. There is only a woman in a yellow plastic chair, and a boy who got to choose which of 2 sentences to believe, and a small light that turned out in the end to be low enough and slow enough to lead a whole family home through the fog. Small boats matter too, especially in the fog. I almost cut the grandmother's line 3 times. The one about showing up, I kept thinking it was too small, too plain to whole story. The thing is, I don't think that anymore. I'm at the age where I'm starting to notice the people who clean the rooms I walk through. The ones everybody assumes leave at 5. I never used to notice. That's not a nice thing to admit. I'm admitting it. I keep coming back to who's hearing this at 1 in the morning. Maybe you just finished a double on a ward. Maybe you're nobody's family by the time the sun comes up. I wrote this one for you. I'll be back next week with someone else the world keeps walking past. Here's the line I couldn't cut. You don't have to be somebody to somebody. You just have to show up.